As I mentioned, Professor Eric Heyer will be speaking today. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1990 and is currently associate professor in the Department of Political Science at BYU. He also serves as the coordinator for Asian Studies. And we were just doing the math. He's been doing that for 11 years, which we think is longer than Xi has been running China. His research focuses on China's foreign relations. He's authored many articles on China's arms sales, territorial issues, and U.S.-China relations. His book, The Pragmatic Dragon, China's Grand Strategy and Boundary Settlements, was published by the University of British Columbia Press in 2015. I'll also mention that there's a website that builds upon his work, which is a great opportunity to explore his research further with really interesting video shorts from various locations where China's neighbors share boundaries on chinaboundaries.com. And so you can get more information about his research and see the book illustrated and visualized in a very interesting way. The title for today's lecture, Is China the Cause of International Disorder? Please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Heyer.
Thank you, Corey. We have been colleagues for many years, haven't we? And thanks to the rest of you for showing up. I had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I think some of you may feel it's a little bit cool, but I feel a little bit hot up here. So I want to move through my remarks today quite quickly. As I began jotting down my ideas, it eventually grew to 5 pages of notes. But I will move through because I want to save time for questions. But what I would like to do today is first of all, cover some general perspectives on China and international disorder. Talk a few minutes about China's peaceful rise beginning in 1978. Talk about China's current challenge to international order, international organizations, and then talk a little bit about U.S.-China relations and the trajectory of U.S.-China relations, and finish, and it ends up being the longest part of my notes, China and Afghanistan, which I think is a contemporary and interesting topic. And Afghanistan is a place that I've been fascinated with since my childhood and have visited a few times. First of all, to put things in perspective, let me say that the rise of China and the impact of China on international order and disorder was foreseen and predicted. In the 1800s, in probably 1805, about Napoleon Bonaparte made his famous quote that is oftentimes quoted and misquoted, where he said, "There lies a sleeping giant," referring to China, "let him sleep, for when he wakes, he will shake the world." Fast forward to 2001, John Mersheimer, one of the preeminent scholars of international relations, wrote an important book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, in which he predicted, this was 20 years ago when China and the United States were still very good friends, when he argued that China would gradually rise and it would eventually challenge the United States hegemony and would be disruptive of international order, that order based upon United States primacy. He was speaking at a time when liberal internationalism and U.S. primacy was very popular among scholars, and many people thought that his prediction would be wrong, that China would eventually experience what we call convergence, and China would embrace international order and would embrace liberal democracy and would become much like the rest of the world because of its economic interaction with the world. And it hasn't turned out that way, has it? But China's peaceful rise is a fact. It wasn't that many years ago, it was 4 decades ago. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping overturned the Maoist revolutionary politics of China and put China on the course of opening and reform, and China became a very market-oriented capitalist country with a communist party in power. And China's rise, I think, is obvious to all of you. You know that China's rapidly rise it has moved from a very poor nation in the backwaters of Asia to now it's a manufacturing giant, and it's one of the largest trade powers in the world, and its economy is second only to the United States. That's a phenomenal rise in 4 decades. So while China's rise has had impacts upon the international world, I don't think we should blame China for that, because China was simply excelling in the global market that the United States dominated and constructed in World War II. Long before Beijing became a player in this international order and markets, it was already in place and dominated by the United States and its European allies, and China certainly took advantage of free trade and free enterprise to rapidly rise. But as China became more and more powerful, in the late 1990s, China began to chafe under the domination of American primacy and began to push back against the U.S.-dominated world order. In April of 1997, along with Russia at the time, by the way, in the wake of the Cold War and the period of time which we sometimes refer to as a unipolar moment, when the United States was unquestionably the most powerful country in the world and was not challenged by any other countries, China and Russia began to push back. In 1997, they issued a joint statement which said their purpose was, quote, to promote the multipolarization of the world and establish a new international order. So they did say that they wanted to change the world system. China increasingly denounced what it considered Western hypocrisy. By talking about Western hypocrisy, China was primarily talking about the unilateral foreign actions of the United States and its allies, its European allies. Especially bothersome to China was the U.S.-NATO war in Kosovo in 1999, followed by the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, and then the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. All of these were not sanctioned by the United Nations, and all of these were led by a neoconservative leadership who was about regime change and overthrowing illiberal or undemocratic regimes and putting American-style democracy in their place. China, of course, was very opposed to that. China favors much more what we call traditional international values, the values of sovereignty and non-interference in other countries' international affairs. So China began to push back against what they felt was Western pressure on non-democratic regimes to change. And they began to do this both internationally and domestically. Domestically, China began to put into place laws, as other countries did, laws that would restrict the activities of liberal non-government organizations that were focused on democracy and human rights and things like that. They felt this was a threat to their regime. And this became clear, more and more clear as they began to see the color revolutions take place in the Middle East and other countries around the world and in Ukraine. China proposed an alternative, and that was what they called civilizational diversity. In other words, not just Western dominant democracies, but civilizational diversity. And China began to promote the value of civilizational diversity through the establishment of Confucius Institutes, for example, around the world. There are about 500 Confucian institutes around the world. These are centers to promote Chinese values and Chinese culture and Chinese history, much like the United States had been doing ever since World War II through the United States Information Agency. And the French had done through Maison Française, or the British through the British Council, promoting their values. China began to do that. And also, China began to extend many scholarships to students from around the world to come and study in China. So China has a very large foreign student population in China, not only studying Chinese, but studying in Chinese universities. And most of these, I should say, are funded by Chinese government scholarships. So you can see that China is in fact mimicking many things that the United States had earlier done when we were at our peak, promoting our values, promoting student foreign exchanges, inviting students to our country on scholarships and things like that. Now, with the rise of China and this dominant position that they now hold, China has begun to challenge the, quote, liberal international order. The liberal international order was put in place just after World War II by the United States and its European allies, especially Great Britain. And they have begun to promote alternatives to that hegemonic order dominated by the United States. They're not trying to overthrow that order in a revolutionary way as the Soviet Union did in the past, but they certainly want to change that liberal international order to reflect their interests and their values. And I don't think that this means that we're headed to some kind of hegemonic conflict between the United States and China, what many people refer to as a Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap is an argument that whenever a nation rises and begins to challenge the dominant power, inevitably we have seen conflict, global conflict. This is the case with the rise of Napoleonic France and the Napoleonic Wars. It was the case with the rise of Germany and the onset of World War I and World War II, and it was the case with the rise of Japan and the Second World War in the Pacific. All of these countries were rising nations, inevitably came into conflict with other European powers and the United States. I don't necessarily see that in the offing, but certainly we're moving into a period of challenges as the United States and China work out their relationship in the future, and China finds its new place in the international order. So they're primarily pushing back against what I would call American primacy, American domination of the world. China seeks greater accommodation in international organizations. It wants a stronger voice in these international organizations. The phrase they use is, quote, the democratization of international politics. By democratization, they're indicating that they don't want one voice, the United States voice, to be the only dominant voice in international organizations, but feel that other countries must have their positions and their views listened to. So they're confronting American unilateralism, essentially, and promoting what they consider a fair multilateralism. So those are words that are commonly used in Chinese parlance: democratization of international politics, confronting unilateralism of the United States, and promoting, quote, fair multilateralism. China has set about doing this by, in a very concerted way, taking a more forceful and leadership position in international affairs. And here's some examples I can give you. In 2001, China organized what is known as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is a collective security organization including the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, China and Russia, and now also includes India and Iran and Mongolia as an observer example. This was a specific effort by the Chinese to, and this excludes the United States and Europe, this was a specific effort by the Chinese to organize a collective security organization in its neighborhood that was not dominated by NATO and the United States. There was a great fear that NATO was pushing eastward, and this is the way that China was pushing back against that. The major principles of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization reflect Chinese values, the values of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and certainly other non-liberal principles. They do not question the issues of democracy and human rights in those other countries. This was followed in 2009 with the organization of BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. So it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The five emerging middle powers. These are all great countries with certain potential, great economic potential. This was initiated in 2009 as a way to push back against the G7. The G7 is the organization of the United States, France, Britain, Canada, Japan, the major European industrial democracies. And China wanted to push back against their domination and also reflect the changing global balance of power. Amid America in 2009, America was in financial crisis at that time, and there was a global financial crisis. And at that time, the BRICS stood up and said, look, we are middle important powers. We're going to push back against the domination of the G7, which have really messed up the management of international financial affairs. So the BRICS pledged to, quote, support a more democratic and just multipolar world order, one based upon the rule of international law, equality, mutual respect, cooperation, coordinated action, and collective decision-making of all states. So you can see clearly pushing against the domination of the United States and its European allies in places like Kosovo, Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq earlier. They called for the organization of multiple, what they call dialogue organizations. China has now organized significant dialogue organizations with all of the African countries. It's quite a spectacle to be in Beijing and see 50 African heads of state show up in Beijing for a China-Africa dialogue, which is done about every 3 years. All the flags flying, all the pomp and ceremonies, quite impressive to see them orchestrate 50 heads of state from Africa at one time in the Beijing capital. Another major dialogue organization is the Central Eastern Europe Dialogue Organization, which involves about 13 Central European states that have constant ongoing dialogue with the United States over economic issues, development issues, finance, and things like that. And then also the very significant dialogue organization with the Latin American states also. So you can see that China is beginning to encroach into or push into areas, spheres that were traditionally American spheres of influence, especially in Latin America and Europe, and making great headway in Africa. So China has also proposed a new international economic order, as I mentioned earlier. The proposal of the new international economic order takes very specific form in the case of several important institutions. In 2014, the BRICS organization, remember this is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS organization organized something known as the New Development Bank. The New Development Bank was a bank to help finance development in these countries and other countries. And it's dominated by China, of course. It rejects Western-style conditionality. Western-style conditionality, which is reflected in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, dominated by the United States, puts conditionality on loans. Financial help to develop their economies or build infrastructure is conditional upon certain kinds of political reforms that generally push these countries to embrace liberal democracy, women's rights, and things like that. China says specifically, we will not intervene and dictate the policies of your countries. We will give you the financing to develop your economies as you see fit. And the New Development Bank, organized by BRICS, is one way of doing that, and is, of course, dominated by China. A few years later, or I should say just the next year, in 2015, China headed the organization of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. The United States has never joined and has encouraged most of its allied and friendly nations not to join, but some have. This was organized in 2015 as an alternative to the World Bank. So that the United States, which dominates the World Bank, China says, look, there are development models and financing necessary that don't reflect American values as reflected in the World Bank, and we want to promote those values and that investment. And so the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, is the way that China does that. And then probably the most significant economic initiative by the Chinese is the Belt and Road Initiative. One Belt, One Road. It's gone through several permutations, but now we just refer to it as the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, which was started in 2013. It's the pet project of Xi Jinping. It is essentially a China-dominated infrastructure finance network project. China finances roads, railroads, ports and harbors, major infrastructure, funded by Chinese, engineered by the Chinese, and oftentimes constructed by Chinese also, and all roads do lead to Beijing. It's a way of developing an infrastructure through Central Asia, through Southeast Asia, going all the way to Europe, and Italy, by the way, is part of the BRI project, to facilitate rapid transportation of goods and services back and forth across the world through a Chinese constructed or Chinese designed network. So you can see that this is a major challenge to the United States. And frankly, I think the United States is still quite on its back foot on this. We don't know quite how to respond. I mean, this is nothing more than a Marshall Plan on huge steroids. The Marshall Plan was a significant economic program by the United States, put in place by the United States after World War II to rebuild Europe through the IBR, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which eventually became the World Bank. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially using the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank and Chinese banking and finance to build a network of infrastructure throughout the world. And this is something that is warmly embraced by many developing countries, especially in Africa too. And there is legitimate criticism. Sometimes the financing is difficult. Sometimes it becomes a debt trap, where these countries become indebted to China and they can't afford to pay those debts. Sometimes they're poorly planned projects, and so there's plenty of criticism. But I think on the whole, there's also a lot of positive things to say about the Belt and Road Initiative, and it certainly is very significant and warmly embraced by Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asian countries. So China is clearly emerging as a dominant non-Western power which is changing the ordering infrastructure of the world so that the focus is no longer on the unilateral domination of the United States, but now becoming competitive with China. And we would refer to this as the ordering infrastructure of international political economy. It's a clear competition of hegemonic powers. China always said it would never become a hegemonic power, but it is clearly a hegemonic power, as is the United States. And so we have these two great hegemonic powers confronting each other. But as I said earlier, I can go into more detail later on, I don't see this as some kind of Thucydides trap where we're eventually going to go to war. China's expansion in many ways is very much like American expansion. It's not expansion through territorial and war, but rather through international finance and promoting a model of development that is certainly now different from the United States. Now, let me talk for a little bit here about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations, because this is certainly part of this. First of all, recall that there's been a strong bipartisan embrace of China since the 1960s, initiated by a Republican, President Nixon, when he was a candidate, to bring China into the family of nations. Nixon made his famous visit to Beijing in 1972. That was followed up by further negotiations and eventually the full normalization of relations by Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat. So it was very bipartisan. And subsequent presidents, Reagan, Obama, everybody, Clinton, have all continued to embrace this idea of bringing China into the family of nations. And in the back of their minds certainly was this notion of convergence, that if China embraces international institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, eventually the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, eventually their domestic politics should start reflecting sort of liberal values also. That it really hasn't worked out that way. But I want to point out that this was a bipartisan effort. For example, even after the bloody suppression of the student democratic movement in China in June of 1989, President Bush still embraced China and refused to put severe sanctions on China, arguing that he wanted to maintain a dialogue with the moderates in China and continue their process of integrating into the international system, the liberal world order. Clinton came to office pledging that he would take a hard line on China, but quickly abandoned that hard line on China and actually began to set the course for China to embrace and join the World Trade Organization, which eventually did in 2001, a significant event in the international political economic history of China. And once China joined the World Trade Organization and joined the free trade system, they have become very quickly a dominant power in that international trade system. Even despite some issues in U.S.-China relations, after September 11th of 2001, the attack on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, President Bush's first foreign trip was actually to China at the end of September of 2001, where he and, at that time, Jiang Zemin emerged from their meeting arm in arm, pledging a joint war on terrorism. So China became our ally in the war on terrorism. Beginning in 2001, we participated, all of us, in fighting terrorism, but also in other aspects, sharing intelligence and things like that. But the fissures in our relationship began to show more clearly, especially with the global financial crisis in 2008, when the United States was devastated by a housing market collapse and a financial crisis, and that eventually had a huge impact upon our friends and allies, Japan, Korea, and our European neighbors. China basically went through the 2008 financial crisis unscathed. It dented their foreign trade a little bit, but they poured huge sums of money into infrastructure projects, building bridges, high-speed railway, new ports and harbors. And so China was virtually untouched. But it did begin to illustrate tensions in the United States' domination of world order, and China began to challenge that. China began to point out that the United States had mismanaged world financial order, that the United States' own economic house was in disorder, and China's economic house was in pretty good order. We engaged with the Chinese after the 2008 global financial crisis in a series of what we call strategic and economic dialogues, trying to address the differences in our relationship. China was embraced as, quote, a responsible stakeholder in the international economic order. But those strategic and economic dialogues largely failed to overcome serious differences over trade, ideological differences in human rights and things like that, and strategic differences for sure. And that brings us to the Trump administration. So my point is, relations with China were deteriorating long before Trump ever came to office, but certainly Trump put a strong exclamation mark on the difficulties in U.S.-China relations and began the process of decoupling from China, encouraging American companies to withdraw their operations from China, imposing sanctions on Chinese companies, Huawei and others. In other words, it turned from China being a strategic, responsible stakeholder to China now becoming a great power competitor of the United States in both national security and trade issues. So relations with China took a very bad turn. Now, I must say that Biden has continued to stay the Trump course. Biden has not done anything significant to change that course. He's made some minor changes. Climate change. We still try to engage China on climate change. This last month in August, John Kerry was in Beijing to discuss the climate problem and to solicit Chinese support to address the international climate problems. China is willing to do that. China is one of the major producers of batteries that go into our cars. They're one of the major producers of solar panels that generate electricity. China is certainly on the technological forefront of the war against climate change. But China has also linked cooperation with the United States on climate change with other issues that are important to them, like Taiwan, human rights, and things like that. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, told John Kerry, I forgot his name for more than, told John Kerry after their meeting that, quote, work on climate change cannot possibly be divorced from other geopolitical tensions. The U.S. side hopes that climate cooperation can be an oasis in China-U.S. relations. But if this oasis is surrounded by desert, it will also desertify sooner or later. In other words, China is clearly saying that if you want cooperation on climate change, we need cooperation on other issues. Taiwan being one of those big issues, North Korean nuclear proliferation, and other things. So things are linked. So looking forward at U.S.-China relations now, when there was a bipartisan embrace of China back in the 1970s and 1980s, now there's a bipartisan rejection of China. There's no real movement in U.S.-China relations. Businesses are frustrated by this. They're frustrated with President Biden's slow pivot away from Trump's trade war with China. Nothing has really changed, and businesses are anxious to get back to business with China. But Biden has not made any significant changes in U.S. policy. So the challenge at present for the United States and American liberal primacy, the American primacists, those who advocate that the United States should always be militarily and economically dominant, they want to frame China as a threat, primarily due to its domestic policies, its communist system. They only have vague references to indications of China somehow being some kind of territorial expansionist power. But primarily it's, we can't trust a communist system. We need to preserve American primacy. For me, though, the greatest China threat is more likely its growing influence in international institutions and organizations. And the United States needs to find out how to effectively respond to that. China, an American armed global domination is simply not tenable anymore after Afghanistan and things like that. We cannot maintain our dominance through military power, and we need to up our economic game if we want to compete with China, because China is a very, very good economic competitor, and I see that as the major threat. Not that we're going to go to war with each other, but we need to find how to be economically competitive, both at home and abroad. We need to figure out how to be more effective in leadership in international institutions. These are all things, and this is my criticism of the Trump administration, is they rejected participation in international organizations and essentially says, if you don't want to play by our rules, we're leaving the field. And they surrendered that field to the Chinese, and the Chinese moved into important leadership positions. Trump was critical of our allies in Europe, Korea, Japan. Those are allies that we desperately need, and we need their help to have a multilateral response to the China challenge. So I think that's the greatest challenge we face. It's not some future war with China or something like that. Let me turn for the last few minutes here, and then we'll go to question and answers, to Afghanistan, kind of the big elephant in the room. China's interest in Afghanistan right now is primarily the insecurity in Afghanistan that may spill over into China. The Taliban are a radical Islamist movement, and they're afraid that that Islamist movement will have an impact upon Xinjiang, where the majority of Chinese Muslims live, the Uyghurs. There is an organization in Xinjiang, the East Turkestan Independence Movement. The Uyghurs refer to Xinjiang or Western China as East Turkestan. The East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is recognized by the United States as a terrorist organization, has engaged in a few terrorist acts. And Islamist ideology is growing influential. And so the Chinese are concerned that as Afghanistan dominated by the Taliban, and they share a border. If you look at the map, it's a little bit too small over there, but Afghanistan goes over and just touches China. They share a border. So they're concerned that in their neighborhood is the rise of this Islamist movement, which will then have an impact upon Western China. That's a primary concern that they have. China, in a recent statement, said, quote, "If the Taliban cannot exercise effective control over the whole of Afghanistan, then the history of the 1990s could repeat itself when Afghanistan was racked by civil war. Then the history of the 1990s could repeat itself, and the three evil forces of terrorism, separatism, and extremism are likely to spill over into other countries. Given such a possibility, China should take precautionary measures to safeguard peace and development." So China now looks at the Taliban government as a challenge and a source of possible instability. A second concern they have is that now that the United States is relieved of the burden of Afghanistan and the burden of that ongoing war and seemingly never-ending war in Afghanistan, this imposed a burden on the United States and distracted us from our major challenges around the world. And now with Afghanistan behind us, will the United States be able to effectively transfer its attention to the Indo-Pacific and organize our allies with the Japanese, the Indians, and the Australians to challenge the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific? So China, in some ways, was happy to see the United States leave Afghanistan because they didn't like the United States military on its border, but also were bothered by the end of the war in Afghanistan with the concern that, this will now give the United States an opportunity and the resources and the attention to turn more to China. So if Washington devotes greater attention to China, that's probably a good thing for the United States, but it's something that the Chinese are somewhat concerned about. Now, China also has adopted an important propaganda angle on Afghanistan. They've been quick to point out that the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan, the Ashraf Ghani government, rapidly collapsed, and that this is evidence of, quote, "Western democracy is not a universal value, let alone a successful one. The U.S. militarized nation-building program is a demonstrative failure." So they use the propaganda. And they also mention, people in Taiwan must be concerned that the United States will just cut and run when the going gets tough. You people in Korea or Japan. So they've tried to undermine the trust in U.S. allies also. But clearly they see Afghanistan as a demonstration of that America's Western democratic values are a failure, and America's militarized efforts to impose democracy around the world has also a failure. And I think they're quite right in that fact. Now, the Chinese have quickly pivoted to engage the Taliban. Diplomatic engagement with the Taliban is a preemptive effort to forestall instability that they're concerned about. Now, this is not something new. The Chinese participate with the United States in our dialogues with the Taliban in Qatar and other places. The primary dialogue partners were Russia, China, the United States, and the Taliban organization. And so China was already engaging with the Taliban before the fall of the Afghan government and the rise of the Taliban. But much more formal engagement with the Taliban was quickly initiated soon after the United States announced that it would withdraw. In July 28th, just a little over a month ago, China had a major meeting with all the top Taliban leaders in Beijing. You can see the pictures. There's Xi Jinping with them on his side. And they issued a statement. Quote, "We welcome the chance to deepen our ties with Afghanistan. The Taliban is a critical military and political force in Afghanistan and has an important role in the process of peace, reconciliation, and reconstruction." That was the statement they made. But China also participated and on the UN Security Council's resolution to urging the Taliban to be inclusive in their new government, and others involve other people beyond the Taliban, and also to facilitate the peaceful exit of people with the right to leave Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban have reciprocated with nice words about China also. The Taliban spokesman, Zabihullah Mujahid, said, quote, "China is our most important partner and represents a fundamental and extraordinary opportunity for us because it is ready to invest and rebuild our country." Abdul Salam Hanafi, who is now the second deputy prime minister, said, quote, "China has been a trustworthy friend of Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban is willing to continue to promote friendly relations between Afghanistan and China and will never allow Afghanistan territory to threaten China's interests. The Belt and Road Initiative is conducive to the development and prosperity of Afghanistan and the region. Afghanistan hopes to continue to actively support and participate in it." So you can see that Afghanistan presents China challenges and concerns about instability, but also great opportunities for the expansion of its influence, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative. But China is truly concerned that instability in Afghanistan could bleed over into Pakistan. China has a major Pakistan-China economic corridor through Pakistan, and they're afraid that might be disrupted. They're also afraid of the Islamist movements. So China was engaged economically in Afghanistan even before the fall of the Ashraf Ghani government recently. And for example, there's a large copper mine in Mes Anyak that the Chinese began to develop. It didn't go very far. There was too much instability. There's also the big Darya oil fields, which China began investing in 2011. But none of these projects really got off the ground because of instability. But now China, I'm sure, will let the dust settle before moving forward. But if the dust settles and stability comes to Afghanistan, I'm sure the Chinese will be back in a very big way with economic development funds, expertise, and labor. So that China faces both opportunities and challenges. Future relations with Afghanistan are in flux right now. But as China looks at Afghanistan, this is the picture they see. Great Britain failed to impose itself on Afghanistan in the 19th century. Russia failed to impose its system on Afghanistan in the 1980s. And the U.S. failed to impose its system of government on Afghanistan in the 2000s during a 20-year war. So the challenge is now, can China prove that its, quote, agnostic approach to political systems and governance, as well as its preference for building peace through economic development, might be a better model? I think the Chinese will be cautious because they certainly know that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, we have time. I'm actually even happy to stay after too. So please come up, line up. I guess they'd like you to state your name and who you are, just to kind of show off. And
so my name is.
You can just drop your mask.
So my name is Caleb Harding. I'm a computer science major, but I'm also doing the Chinese flagship program at BYU. So I was wondering, so does the U.S. essentially then need its own equivalent of the Belt and Road Initiative to be economically competitive with China, or how will we do that?
I have always been an advocate of that for several years now, that the United States needs to go back and reinvent the Marshall Plan that we put forward in post-war Europe to rebuild Europe, and we need to have more effective engineering, more effective financing, more effective management of an international development model that can compete with China. I definitely think that we do need that. Otherwise, we'll just watch it go by.
And then if I could ask like a follow-up question, I guess
Sure.
when we're already in a lot of debt and have, budget issues, how would we go about, I guess, doing that domestically?
Well, I'm not an economist, but we have certainly debt concerns, but I think, we have to put that in perspective. Just because we don't have the money, do we think we can just nickel and dime our way along while the Chinese are spending billions of dollars on this? And we'll end up in a decade or so with the Chinese dominating the international economy. And we'll realize that we're penny wise but pound foolish. So I think that we need to find a way to finance this, along with our allies, of course, Japan, our European allies. I'm oftentimes stunned when China would propose projects to African countries or Latin America. The best response the United States has was, well, look, we can send our economists to talk to you about it. We can send our bankers to help you read through the finance arrangements and see if they're good or not. We can send our lawyers to help you understand the technicalities of these agreements. But we didn't offer an alternative to them, an effective alternative. Yes, we can build that road. We can build that harbor. We can build that high-speed railway. We have this 5G technology. We don't have it. The Chinese are getting it. We've got to step up our game.
Thank you.
So as a computer science major, get going.
I'm working on it.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I don't know if the mic's on.
Okay.
Speak up louder.
I'll try.
Okay.
So I'm Amelia, English major. I'm curious, you sound kind of grim when you talk about U.S. and China relations. Do you think that the future where we could have more of a positive relationship, or is it kind of just not going to happen at this point?
I'm a realist. I have been. I very much embraced the ideas of Mersheimer 20 years ago. That it is the unfortunate, inevitable situation between great powers that relations are always tense. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain is quite unique. But think back the United States' relation with other great powers, Japan, Russia, now China. I think powers are inevitably to have some level of conflict. But I'm not the pessimist that thinks that there's a Thucydides trap that inevitably will go to war. I think that we have bright diplomats, bright leaders, and we have our mutual interests that will lead us through. But I would predict more difficulty rather than, great smooth relations. Sorry to be pessimistic, but I'm a realist.
It's fine. That's what I wanted to know.
Sure.
Hi,
Yes.
my name's Julia. I'm an international relations major, and I was wondering if you see any other countries going about expanding their interests also through the economic path that China's, and especially in Afghanistan.
I really, there's Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa. These countries all have the potential. They have the landmass. They have the population. They have the resources to mobilize. But unfortunately, India has always been ready to take off, but never has got off the ground. Brazil has always been racked by corruption and ineptitude and problems. Russia is now essentially, a kleptocracy driven by oil. None of these countries all have the potential, but unfortunately haven't risen to global leadership. Collectively, they're trying to assert that leadership through the BRICS organization. So, in other words, I don't think that there's any other country nipping at China's heels. I think China has a clear path toward global domination, along with the United States. I just don't think there's any other countries on the horizon that have the landmass, population, technology to be superpower status.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Will Ford. I'm an economics major, but I plan on going into international relations. Because of how China sees Taiwan as a rogue country, do you think then it's possible that if it sees like the benefits as outweighing the costs, then it will move to a military or otherwise invasion of the island?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the main challenges in global disorder as well as U.S.-China relations is the case of Taiwan. A country that is not a state, by the way. The United States does not recognize Taiwan. We don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Taiwan only has a handful of diplomatic allies. But of course, China asserts a claim to Taiwan, that Taiwan is historically part of China. And they've made it quite clear that they would use military force. Xi Jinping has been more forceful over recent years than past leaders have. Deng Xiaoping put into place something known as the one country, two systems formula, arguing that China could be essentially its own country, it could have its own leadership, its own economic system, it could pursue its democratic aspirations, things like that, as long as it recognized Chinese sovereignty and flew the Chinese flag. Of course, the one country, two systems formula is totally bankrupt now. We saw what happened in Hong Kong that was run under the one country, two systems formula. And so Taiwan is increasingly independent. It has an increasingly strong Taiwanese identity. It has a robust democratic system, a good economy, and it's not at all interested in embracing any form of unification with China. So I think there are voices in China that are pushing harder and harder for a military move. The challenge to the United States is to somehow assure the Chinese that we would respond if they use military power and deter them from thinking about that. But at the same time, while telling the Taiwanese that we support them, we do not support a rapid movement towards independence, which would provoke the Chinese. That's a very difficult policy of ambiguity. How do we reassure Taiwan that we have their back, but don't move towards independence? How do we tell the Chinese, signal the Chinese that, look, don't make a rash move and use military power, because we will respond. I would just put the question to you. I think this is a major dilemma for Americans. If the Chinese do attack Taiwan, what should the United States do? Many years ago, the United States public opinion was, yeah, we'll stand up and support. It's a democracy and things like that. After a disastrous war in Iraq, after a disastrous war in Afghanistan, I think the American population would say primarily that, look, it's a little island in the, Pacific. Really, is it that important to us? Do we want to? How many American lives are you willing to spend in Taiwan? How much treasure are you willing to spend in Taiwan? I would just say that's a difficult question. But for the United States to stand and watch a democratic country, which is a vibrant democracy, economically strong, vibrant, to watch it taken down by a communist, and I think the government would feel compelled to do something about it.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Sure. There's a few people behind you, but go ahead.
What would be the geopolitical consequences for China if it invaded Taiwan? Like, would it be a shot in shooting themselves in the foot in the long run?
It would be disastrous. You would hope that the rest of the world would stand up. No, this just can't stand. This is sort of akin to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. This will not stand. And you'd think that the Japanese, the Koreans, our European allies would all step up and say, no, you don't watch a democratic country taken down by a communist country, and they would stand up for that. So you think that, I believe that China is a pragmatic country. I think they think through the costs and benefits of what they do, and hopefully they'll be pragmatic enough to understand that a military move against Taiwan would have severe political and economic effects far beyond their imagination. And if they think that Tiananmen, sort of, people forgot about Tiananmen in 1989 soon after, I think Taiwan would be a different matter. Thank you. I just hope it never happens.
Hi, my name is Gabe. I'm a political science major. It seems that there's a lot of interest in Chinese demography lately. People talk about how China's becoming older. There's really low fertility rates. I was wondering if you had any opinions on whether their changing demographics is going to affect their ability to maintain their position in international power.
It's a serious problem for the Chinese. China has for several years now abandoned its one-child per family policy. Now it's encouraging families with multiple births. The biggest challenge that China has right now is that young couples are saying, they don't want more children. China's become like Taiwan and Korea, which have very low birth rates, and European countries with very low birth rates. It's a demographic challenge for the Chinese. China is becoming very old, and they're not yet that rich overall per capita on a per capita basis. Unlike India, which has a very young population, the United States, which has a very vibrant population. So it's a serious threat, and the Chinese are taking clear measures to do that. The education, they've recently imposed policies that kids can't play video games more than like 1 hour a week or something like that because it's distracting them. It's a burden on parents. They can't have these expensive after-school programs, English tutoring, math tutoring, because families are complaining that the financial cost of even one child in China now is overwhelming them. There's no way they would consider having 2 or 3 children. So things are working against the growth in fertility in China, and I think they understand this is a serious problem. But this problem goes way back. Bottom line, the Chinese government has always, the communist government has always been willing to intervene in family policy. First of all, telling you only to have 1 child, and now trying to tell you to have 2 or 3 children. I mean, it's just a government which imposes itself upon people's personal choices.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hall. I'm a pre-business major, and I just have a simple question. What can we do as college students to improve our international relationship with China?
Get to know more Chinese. Study Chinese, get to know China. The relations between the American people and the Chinese people is really good. I mean, I have very dear Chinese friends. A lot of Chinese still come to the United States to go to school. A lot of Americans go to China. At the government level, relations are pretty difficult. But below the government level, relationship among the people and businesses are still pretty good. So I would just encourage people to study more about China, to know more about China, to travel to China if possible, engage Chinese students at BYU in conversations about their feelings and get to know China better. China is not a big bad monster, but it's not a panda bear either. There's always this dilemma. Is China the dragon or is it the panda bear? And there's the dragon slayers who want to fight China, see it as a big enemy. And there's the panda huggers who just think it's all unique and Confucian and cute panda bear. It's someplace in the middle, but that's the best advice I can give you. I've spent my whole career trying to do that, by the way, but it's coming to an end.
Hi, my name is Emily Kwan. I'm majoring in computer engineering.
Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. My question is, so as China gets involved in Afghanistan and economic affairs, do you think they will eventually succumb to that urge to become more militaristically involved, or do you think they will learn from that?
China, if we look over the last few decades, China has not become militarily involved in other countries. Since the founding of the People's Republic, they've only had 2 foreign wars in Korea and India, 3, Korea, India, and Vietnam, where they actually went outside their borders. But it will be a test of the China's program that can they allow the Taliban to be the Taliban with their Islamist ideology and prove that China's economic policies of modernization will be effective? Or will they simply get into the situation where they invest lots of money in Afghanistan, Afghanistan continues to be a basket case, and then the Chinese feel urged to step in and maybe take over, and through what they call debt equity swaps, saying, okay, we're going to have to take over Afghan resources to get our money out of the country. This is what happened in Sri Lanka, where they built a huge port in Hambantota. The Sri Lankan government could no longer pay the cost of building that port, so the Chinese went in and says, fine, we'll just take it over for 99 years and operate it ourselves and get our investment back. So the Chinese could find themselves in that dilemma in Afghanistan, but I don't envision the Chinese deploying military to Afghanistan in the foreseeable future. I just don't see that.
Great, thanks.
Hopefully they learn from Britain, Russia, and the United States that that is not a workable proposition. It would just be a graveyard for the Chinese empire, like it has been for others.
Absolutely.
My name is Delaney Schill, and I am a pre-choral education major. For U.S. citizens,
So let me ask you, what is pre-choral?
so choir.
Oh, you haven't learned to sing yet, but you're learning to sing, then you'll become, okay. I'm just teasing.
For U.S. citizens striving to become more globally aware, what aspects of Chinese culture are most vital to understand?
Chinese history. China has a rich, fascinating history. Pick up some good books on Chinese history and understand Chinese history. I think that's the best thing. And there are some good books out there. There's some good courses on campus taught by some great professors in Chinese history and Chinese culture that I would encourage you to take. China has a rich culture. There are great courses in the humanities also on Chinese civilization and culture that I would encourage you to take. And if you have the time, you could take Chinese political science. But I would start out with history and culture. And there's plenty offered at BYU. We have a very strong China program at BYU. Good language instruction, good history. The politics is okay. The humanities is great.
Hi, my name is Taylor Nelson. I'm a communications major. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I was just wondering if you could talk about the human rights violations in Hong Kong and the Free Hong Kong movement and where you see that going.
Not in a good direction at all. Human rights in China, of course, is a very big topic, and I didn't even touch on it. Serious violation of human rights in Xinjiang or suppression of Uyghurs. It simply stuns me that the Taliban says such nice things about China, and the Taliban fashions themselves as an Islamist movement protecting the interests of Muslims around the world, and right next door there's major suppression of Uyghurs who are Muslims. I think the Taliban are really more about power and interest than they are promoting Islam. I think that's proven in that. Hong Kong is a very sad case, incredibly sad. Push came to shove. Hong Kong people continue to push back against increasing and onerous laws put in place by the administration, which was backed by the Chinese, national security laws, free speech laws, and they kept pushing back, and the Chinese kept pushing back harder and eventually suppressed the movement, jailed many of the leaders, and many of them fled. I don't see that turning around. I don't think that the democratic movement in Hong Kong, which is now very small, and the student movement for human rights has the wherewithal or, sadly, the international support to push back. Unfortunately, it's a sad case, but that's the reality. Okay, thank you all for coming.